and for anyone who's not in Central Oregon, good evening. My name is Paige. I'm with Deschutes Public Library, and we are here as part of Deschutes Public Library's virtual programming. Before we formally begin the presentation, just a few words about tonight's program. This is part of our No Pacific Northwest. We are looking at Rajneeshpuram and the failed Utopia of Bhagwan. So if you're not in the right place, we do hope you stick around, but this is what we're talking about this evening, just to get everyone grounded. All right, our presenter tonight is Russell King. He is a writer, investigator, and attorney. In 2018, he created the podcast Building Utopia, Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh, which explores the history of Bhagwan and his disciples using an immersive narrative nonfiction approach. A former partner at an international law firm who specialized in complex litigation, King draws on his experience piecing together factual narratives based on contradictory evidence to tackle this rich and complicated history. And we are so very grateful that you did, because we're really excited to welcome you here tonight, Mr. Russell King. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Paige. I'm so thrilled to be here. I'm so glad that you guys invited me to come and speak about this, particularly given the very local connection to this history. So I'm very excited for the conversation tonight.
Good, absolutely. For those of you who are not aware, Deschutes Public Library is based out of Central Oregon, and Central Oregon, of course, features very heavily in this very interesting history. We are about an hour and a half away from the site of the complex, the commune, the compound of Rajneeshpuram. And we are, so we're not super next door, but we are in the near vicinity. And we're also just outside of Portland, Oregon, which also features heavily in the history too. So this is very local to us, and there might be some people out there who even have experience firsthand with this interesting event. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Why don't we start from the very beginning? Can you please, in, I don't know, just a few minutes, just give us a little bit of overview. Who was Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh? Who were the Rajneeshis, and why did they come to America? And specifically, why did they come to Central Oregon?
Yeah, so Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh was an Indian guru and mystic who came to fame in the 1960s in India. And he was a professor of philosophy who began sort of going on to a traveling guru circuit that existed in India in the 1960s. And he would speak to massive crowds of people in India who were interested to hear his very spicy takes on religion, on sexuality, on sex, on relationships, on politics. He really gathered a loyal following of people that would just come to hear him speak. And he was pretty inflammatory, so he stood out from other gurus in that respect. By 1970, he settled down in Bombay, what's now known as Mumbai, and began taking on disciples, who he called his sannyasins. He founded an ashram in 1974 in India, and then, as you mentioned, by 1981, his movement was uprooted and moved to America, including the guru himself. And so this man who had never set foot outside of India before was suddenly flown on a 747 jet to JFK Airport and was temporarily housed in New Jersey before moving to Oregon, where he founded the Rajneeshpuram commune in Central Oregon, as you mentioned. So to your question about why they came to America, I would say it's a complicated history, but I guess that's why I wrote a book about it, was to explain kind of everything that was going on at the time. But by the time he left India, in 1981, he'd become a pretty controversial figure there among politicians, among the government. There was a tax investigation that was going on that was pretty intense. And frankly, they were outgrowing the space for their ashram in Pune, India, which was a college town outside of Mumbai. They had this very lavish, lush ashram there that thousands of people would come to, tens of thousands would come to each year. They just didn't have enough space. And so they had always been talking about moving somewhere bigger. Hello, Kitty. And then eventually they realized they needed to locate beyond India itself, because there were just so many political pressures on the community at the time. And so he had a very ambitious young secretary, Ma Anand Sheela, who had spent time in the US, who loved America, and who ultimately persuaded him to take really a leap of faith and leave his whole community behind and travel to America.
That's fascinating. So you said tens of thousands of people would come to listen to him speak. And in the book, and real quick, the book actually started as a podcast. Is that correct? In
Yeah,
2018, the podcast preceded the book.
that's right.
Wow,
Yeah.
fascinating. So we'll get into how exactly that transition happened. But first, let's just get an overview of the history of this in a very convoluted story. So tens of thousands of people are coming to India. The compound is getting too small to house everyone. And so he takes this leap of faith across the ocean to come to Central Oregon, of all places.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that Central Oregon was where he picked? And what do you think about Bhagwan in particular made him so special and different from other, I'll say religious leaders, because he was eventually one of those, but what made him different from other gurus?
Yeah, I'll start with the second question first about what made him special, what set him apart. So starting in the 1960s, probably the biggest thing that distinguished him from other gurus was his frank talk about sexuality. It's something that other Indian gurus at the time just were not really discussing as frankly as he was. And for him, sex was religious. Sex was a spiritual experience. And so he didn't shy away from it. He thought it was important to talk about it, to understand it, and not to be sort of a prude about it. Of course, this was very controversial at the time. It was a sort of conservative society, and he got a lot of flack for it, but he also got a very devoted following because of it. So that initially set him apart. But then when he started taking on disciples in the early 1970s, he attracted a huge Western following, people from Europe, people from America, from Canada, from Australia, from South Africa. And they were drawn to him for various reasons, but it's important to know that at the time there was sort of a find your guru movement going on that we don't see so much today, but in the 1970s, there were a lot of young people who were seekers, and they were spiritual seekers. They were reading Hermann Hesse and others, and trying to understand spirituality, Eastern mysticism, yoga, things like that, meditation. And so they were coming to India, they were coming to the East to explore their spirituality and in some ways to find themselves, to find their authentic selves. And so there were various gurus that were there that were taking on disciples where people could go meet them. But Bhagwan was really special in that he was very well versed in Western culture, Western literature, Western psychology. He got it. And he spoke beautiful English that developed over time, but he could speak with his disciples one-on-one. And so especially in the early days in Mumbai, when he was based out of his apartment, a potential disciple would come in, he'd be greeted by his secretary, they'd be led into his personal room where they'd get a private audience with the guru. He would be sitting in a chair, they would kneel or sit at his feet, they'd be looking up at him. And I interviewed so many people who said that there was sort of a magnetic allure to him. He had these deep probing eyes, he would stare into a person, and he would ask really intimate questions about their lives, what they were looking for. People who knew him said that he had a unique ability to connect with people and to kind of draw them out. And yeah, so I think that's part of what he did. He also used some, I wouldn't say smoke and mirrors, but there was also sort of these techniques that he used to create familiarity with new disciples, with new people, that included a sense of inevitability, where they would walk into his room and he would say, "You finally come. You finally found me. You're finally here. I've been waiting for you." And so if you're a Western seeker from New Jersey who's coming to the East and who wants to understand more about spiritualism, and now you're sitting before this whitebeard guru who's saying, "You finally come to me," you can kind of see some of the magnetic allure that was there. The only other thing I'd say on that is that he made becoming a disciple very easy. This was not, 10 years of kneeling on a stone floor and reciting mantras or anything like that. Really, all you had to do was say, "I want to become your disciple. I want to surrender to you as my master." And from there, it was pretty easy to become a disciple of Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh. So I think that's part of what set Bhagwan apart from other gurus at the time and made him so attractive to people. And then your second question was about, remind me again.
Yes. So the second question is, there's this spiritual leader in Mumbai, and then he flies all the way over to Central Oregon. Why do you think that Central Oregon was the place of this new utopia?
Yeah, so for better or worse, for the people of Central Oregon, it was a fluke. I mean, they could have ended up anywhere in America. I mean, the decision was made for Bhagwan to come to America, and they were going to build the new commune, this vaunted new commune they've been talking about for a long time. They were going to build it in America. That was going to be his new spiritual Mecca, where he wanted all of his disciples to gather together to live in some isolated community where they could create what he called a Buddha field, create this spiritual, sort of mystical, isolated area where master and disciple could work together in a mystery school. They could kind of find themselves in this special environment. But when they brought him here, they had no commune. They had no plan. There was no, they didn't have it yet. So when I say leap of faith, I mean, he was leaving behind his very successful ashram for a room in an old castle in New Jersey, Montclair, New Jersey, where they hold him up for a couple of weeks or a couple of months. And so his secretary who brought him over, Sheila, was under intense pressure from the minute she got here to find property where they could build this community, because she didn't have it yet. And now you've got the guru here. He's left all of his disciples behind. Most of them didn't know where he was. Some of them didn't even know he'd left the commune, much left India. And so they needed to find something where he could go and they could kind of regather the flock again. And so she was casting a wide net. She was looking at properties in New Jersey and New York, Texas, Colorado. They were really looking for a big chunk of remote property where they could build what they wanted. And through sort of a connection through Sheila's brother, they found this big muddy ranch property that was available in Central Oregon, right outside of Antelope. It was a 125 square mile tract of land that was high desert plateau, and it was available. It was former ranch land that had been overgrazed and really was just scrub and mud and some juniper trees and some hills and not much else, some old farm buildings. And, you know, Sheila would later talk about it, and still to this day talks about it, as sort of this mystical experience going to the property for the first time. And she just knew that this was it, this magical connection. And I interviewed somebody who was there with her the first time she saw the property, a woman named Deschutes, who said she just needed to find a place. And this was the first place that was doable. They could afford it. It was remote. It had some scenic beauty to it. And so they just kind of plunged right into it and bought the property without really doing much research, just kind of happened to be where they ended up.
So a little bit of a retroactive storytelling there, in which the mystical experience might not quite be how it felt in the moment. So you said that it was this kind of a fluke. They did not intend to land here. It was a bunch of land that was there, and there were some farm buildings. It was all agriculture and such. And that kind of is where I will say the beginning of the end came, was that Oregon's land use was not designated for what they intended. And so can you explain a little bit about that? What was it that they were trying to do out there? What did they start to do? And then what were some of the hurdles that came up for this new utopia built out in the middle of nowhere?
So the minute that the disciples arrived in Oregon, they were immediately at conflict with the people of Oregon, with the Oregon government, local, state, federal. There was an immediate conflict there. And the problem was that they had an intention for that land that was not allowed under the current regulations. And Oregon at the time had very strict, and still does to this day, has very strict land use regulations about what you can do on farmland. And that was originally designed to protect the Willamette Valley when it was brought about in the mid-1970s, the land use regime that was put in place. And it was intended to protect land, even though it was in Central Oregon and was very remote. It was, farmland. It was intended to protect land like that. And under that regime, you could not just buy a piece of farmland and build a dormitory or build a cafeteria or build a printing press. You couldn't do that. You could build only things that were designated for farm use. That's what the land was zoned as. So they bought this ranch that was designated for farm use only, but they came in with the intention of building a commune. That was always the plan. And so there was an immediate conflict there. And as you suggested, it was sort of doomed from the very beginning. I've thought about this a lot, and I've wondered, is there any way that Rajneeshpuram could have succeeded in Oregon? And I think the answer is no. I don't think that they ever could have done what they wanted to do in Oregon, and certainly not on the piece of property that they brought, because what they wanted to do was not allowed. So the only way to get what they wanted would be to bend the law, to push the law, to break the law, or to try to change the law. And those are all stressors that are challenging. So they were in trouble from the beginning. And because, if you're going to move thousands of disciples from around the world to live on your commune, you need to build housing and septic and food. And, there's all these things, transportation, there's all these things that you need, schools for kids. And there just wasn't really a plan to do all of those things within the framework of the laws as they applied to that land. So, so it was trouble from the beginning. And it also, it also sets up the initial conflict with the local people from Bend, from the Dalles, Wasco County, Jefferson County, because right off the bat, when the sannyasins came in, they lied about what they meant to do. Sheila gave press interviews within the first couple of months where she said, this has nothing to do with Bhagwan coming here. This isn't the new commune. We're just building a little farming community that's dedicated to our master. But nothing about this is going to be home to 10,000 disciples and that the guru is going to be installed here. None of that was said and was denied. And then suddenly at the end of August, Bhagwan shows up and is there to live. They say he's just a temporary visitor. He ends up living there permanently until he leaves Oregon, leaves the US. So there was already a lie in the beginning, and the savvy people of Antelope and other areas started seeing all of these trailers moving in, started seeing this heavy equipment coming in. Hard to mask those things. And it was pretty clear early on that this was going to be a major community. And so people started to get suspicious of them, and certainly led to problems in the very short term.
Absolutely. So there's this influx of people right from the start. There's some heads going against one another, saying, okay, this is not quite what you're not being honest about what the actual intent is of this land. And you mentioned there that they could try to change the law, they could go around the law, they could manipulate the law, they could do all these things. They ended up trying all of those avenues, didn't they? Can you try to start to tell us a little bit about, so there's this influx of people, they start building these buildings, and the Bhagwan shows up, and then they're hosting these festivals, which are drawing in 15,000 people. How did that start? Can you explain a little bit about how it went from they find the land, they get the commune started, and then all of the squirreliness that starts to unfold, in which they have to manipulate, lie, and even like beg, barter, and steal their way in to the public government of this area? Can you tell us a little bit about how that all unfolded?
Yeah, so in the early days, it was a lot of deception, which has been admitted by people who were in top leadership at the commune, including the mayor of what became the city of Rajneeshpuram, a guy named Krishna Deva. He later admitted that every building that they built in the initial year or so had a second underlying purpose for the commune that was never disclosed to the zoning authorities, the building authorities, et cetera. So they would build a pole building, which was a farm pole building to hold their equipment or whatever. But it also happened to be a great place to store all of Bhagwan's books, and also had office space on the second story where they could have hundreds of workers doing the administration of Bhagwan's community. They built a greenhouse, but it wasn't any greenhouse. It was a 2-acre large greenhouse that also happened to serve as a meditation hall and had beautiful views of the mountains nearby. I mean, so, and they would bring in these trailers, these mobile housing units that maybe had 3 bedrooms and were supposed to hold maybe 6 people, and they would put 20 people in there. They'd put 12 people, they'd sort of cram them in and conceal the number of people that were actually living on the property. There was this whole kind of cloak and dagger thing where they'd hide people, and if immigration was coming, all the illegal immigrants would be hiding other places, so yeah, there was a lot of smoke and mirrors in the early days. But pretty early on, within the first couple of months, they landed on a legitimate strategy, which they thought would save them. And that was sort of working within the context of the existing laws. And so the laws, the land use laws of Oregon said that if you wanted to do any sort of urban use, you had to do it within the context of an existing city. You had to use something called an urban growth boundary. So if you wanted to build like a new school or something, you could just do it kind of on the fringes of where there already was an urban development. And the sannyasins identified that the land use regulations didn't say anything about what happened with a new city. And the idea was, why don't we just incorporate a new city, a new town on our land, on our ranch land. This is unincorporated county land. Why don't we just put a city there? We'll incorporate it. We'll have a sannyasin city council, sannyasin mayor. We'll receive money from the state. We'll get roads. We'll have a police force. I mean, we'll get all the trappings of a city, but we'll also have control over it because it's all going to be run by sannyasins. And most importantly, they would have control over zoning. And so when they created their city, they could do industrial uses and agricultural uses and residential, whatever they wanted to do. And so that was the plan they followed. Starting within months of them arriving in Oregon, they were meeting with the Wasco County commissioners. They were talking to the land use authorities and coming up with their plan to incorporate their own city. And ultimately in 1982, that's what happened. By the fall of 1982, they had incorporated the city of Rajneeshpuram on their ranch property. And that gave them all of the control that I was just telling you about, where they could build and do all of the things that they wanted to do, but now they could do it legally. And so they had that in place to kind of meet their objectives. And they thought that they were sort of gravy from there, everything was good. But of course, there were immediate legal challenges to that from 1,000 Friends of Oregon, from others on the outside, from governmental authorities who were skeptical of what they were doing. They weren't sure whether it was actually allowed under the law. There was some gray area there that had to be sorted out by the courts. So there were still constant challenges to what they were doing. But that was their plan. They thought if we incorporate a city, we can do what we want. And they really did do that for most of their time that they were in Oregon.
So just now you said that the 1,000 Friends and the Wasco government, everyone's kind of suspicious of why if they were actually able to create the city. What was, if you can distill for us, what was the whole mission statement and values of Rajneeshpuram? What did they tell the people of Oregon why they were there? What was the city built around, the system of values of that city? What were they trying to do there? Can you explain that for us?
Yeah, I can. There's a couple different places you can look to answer that. And I think an interesting place to look to begin with is what Bhagwan himself said about his new community leading up to him leaving India. So he talked about the new commune for years, and he had this utopian vision for what that community would be. And you actually do see many of the things that he talked about back in India implemented in practice when they got to Oregon. So he did have a spiritual vision for this community. I don't know that everything he wanted got done, but a lot of it actually did, to his credit or not, depending on how you look at it. So they actually did get a lot done. And for example, there was going to be no nuclear families at the new commune at Rajneeshpuram. There would be no, people could get married if they wanted to, but there was no idea that there'd be a husband and a wife and kids living together in one house. That just was, to him, an outdated notion. He thought that marriage was a way for people to control each other. And he thought that kids actually would benefit from being raised by multiple adults within the community, multiple sannyasins, not just their parents, who would try to sort of instill their own worldview and their own sort of obsessions on their kids. It was better to kind of have a wide variety of experiences. And so that was implemented in the community. I mean, if a child arrived at Rajneeshpuram with their parents, they would immediately be separated. The parents would be sent to go live with other adults somewhere in the commune that was assigned to them. And the kids would either go live in a bunkhouse with other children, where they'd have very loose monitoring by some kind of rotating adult figures, or they'd be sent to live with adults who were total strangers. They might have to go live in a trailer with, a bunch of other adults that they didn't know. And so that's an example of something where Bhagwan had this vision of what would happen to the commune, and they actually put it into place. There were no nuclear families at Rajneeshpuram. In terms of what they told the community, it's interesting to look at the land use planning, the city comprehensive plans that were put together when Rajneeshpuram was first being discussed. And they talk about Bhagwan's spiritual vision in those documents as well. It's kind of interesting to see these documents intended for government authorities to review, but they're talking about the vision of Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh as this being a peaceful community where people can coexist. And really an underlying theme of everything was living in harmony with ironically living in harmony with neighbors, with the surrounding community, but also living in harmony with nature. That was a big part of their project. And another thing that they actually did implement was a lot of very progressive approaches to like water reclamation and kind of reseeding the land and trying to get it to come back to life. And, so there's a lot of things that they tried to do there in terms of environmental impact that they actually did implement. But really, when they talked about it, they would give some population estimates. Once they had the approval to go forward to the city, they would say, we're expecting this to grow by thousands over the coming years. I think it was going to be less than 10,000 by, year 2000, something like that. But, they expected it to be a community with all of the things that you would find in any small urban community in Central Oregon.
So that's fascinating. There's that freedom there that you talked about. Bhagwan was so insistent upon, the spiritual freedom, and then the freedom of families not living together and such. And then you're bringing that and you're putting it in a very conservative part of Oregon. And so the people of the surrounding towns, Antelope specifically, got really concerned that all the crazy people in the sunset robes, the orange robed people are coming to infiltrate our town, and they're going to brainwash our kids. And what are we going to do about this? So now the orange robe people are trying to build a city. So can you tell us what happened after they got the city kind of established? Then it was taken away from them. There was a retroactive law that was applied because the surrounding government kind of said, wait a second, we don't want this happening. So can you tell us what happened next after Rajneeshpuram became a city? They started bringing in everybody, and they started really building at a frenzied pace. Once they got the approval to go forward, they just leapt into it. So how then did Wasco County and the surrounding neighbors, how did they react to this new city?
Yeah, so there were constant legal challenges, like I said, from the moment the city was first incorporated in 1982, a lot of them led by the land use watchdog, 1,000 Friends of Oregon. And yeah, I think the retroactive rule that you're talking about was seen as sort of the ultimate betrayal, or I guess maybe one of many betrayals that the sannyasins feel that they experienced in Oregon. And that's because at the time that they incorporated their city, they really believed that they were following the law as it was written. Like I said, there was some gray area, but it wasn't clear that they couldn't do what they were doing. It essentially said if you had the right amount of people who voted for it, you could incorporate a city on a rural piece of land like that, an unincorporated piece of county land. And so that's what they did. The problem is that the land use rules were silent on what happens when a new city is incorporated. They really only contemplated existing cities. And so that was the ambiguity that was left there to be exploited. And the sannyasins took it in their favor at first, but then as they started having a lot of successes in court, as they got their city incorporated, as they took over the city of Antelope's government as well, they started getting a lot of political power. They had a lot of wins. And I think people on the outside started to respond in 1983 in various ways to what was seen as this Rajneesh menace, this red menace that was sort of infesting the area. And they were sort of seen as just getting away with everything. And there were people in Oregon who didn't want that to happen anymore. And so one of the things that happened over time was some retroactive rules were put in place in 1983 that essentially said that what happened with Rajneeshpuram's incorporation was actually not allowed under the rules, that they hadn't incorporated it properly. And they didn't say it's improper from 1983 onwards. They said it's actually going to be improper from 1981 onwards. So they backdated the rule. They had a rationale for doing that, but essentially it said that what happened 2 years ago with the Rajneeshis is not valid. And so now this question has to go back to the county, which are in Wasco County, which initially granted the incorporation charter. You need to look at this again and see if under these new rules, is the city allowed? And the answer would be no. So there was always this peril hanging over the legality of the city of Rajneeshpuram on that front, on the land use front. And that persisted through the 4.5 years that Bhagwan was there. There was always a peril to it.
And we have someone from the audience who asked, did the surrounding towns ever try to physically do anything to the commune? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so that was an interesting part of my research. I appreciate that question. Something that surprised me is that I think when people think about Rajneeshpuram and the sannyasins, there's often an image of a red clothed person holding a rifle. And there's this idea of the commune being very militarized and there being guards everywhere and security. And that certainly was true in the last year or two of the commune's existence. But in the first couple of years of Rajneeshpuram, there weren't really guns there. I mean, there were the peace force had some guns, their police force had some guns. A couple of people had concealed carry permits for protecting, like Sheila's husband example had a pistol that he carried to protect her, but it wasn't like a militarized place and there wasn't intense security in those early years. But what surprised me in my research was that there were very credible threats against the disciples themselves. Now, they were provocative. I mean, the disciples would show up to community meetings and people talk about how rude they were, and they would laugh at people and make fun of these elderly people from Bend and from the Dalles who would show up to these meetings in Antelope, for example, and just be kind of rude to them. And so there was a lot of hostility there. But at some community meetings, there's documented evidence that some community members did show up with bullets around their necks, and they did show up flashing guns. A person did flash a gun at Sheila when she was walking on a street in one of the nearby communities. Somebody fired a gun towards Bhagwan's convoy as he was driving around one day. And if you look through Governor Atiya's records, Governor Atiya, who's governor in the early 1980s, you see examples of credible members of the community, people like a DOJ, Department of Justice mediator, calling the governor's office and saying, you have to do something or something violent is going to happen to the sannyasins. I'm going to meetings and I'm scared that somebody's going to get killed, that a woman is going to get raped, that people are going to get kidnapped. They were reporting really serious threats that were coming out of some of the community interactions at the time. Now, again, tensions were high, and I'm not saying that the sannyasins were not provoking some extreme reactions, but of course, violence and threats of violence are never merited. But looking at the records, you can see that there were actual threats towards disciples in those early years. And then, some of the militarization at the commune came after that.
Yes, and so there's credible threats from the very beginning. There's this talk of how this is meant to be a peaceful, spiritual place, and that is kind of coming at odds. That's coming up against the hypocrisy. There is that Bhagwan is driving around in these Rolls Royce, and there's some crazy number of, I can't remember how many cars he owned, and this lavish lifestyle that this spiritual leader and many people who know spiritual leaders in the past from that same area of the world, we think of Buddha and Gandhi, neither of whom we associate lavish lifestyles with. And so then you have this other spiritual leader who's coming in. And so this talk of peace and then this talk of harmony with our neighbors and with our land is immediately being set against their actions and these then threats of violence, and then, as you said, the militarization of the compound. And then also there are some shady things that have happened, as you said before. Right from the beginning, there were miscommunications, we can call it, about what the true intentions were of this land use, and then also followed by some drastic measures that the sannyasins had to take in order to protect their land and protect their space on the land. Can you tell us about some of the shenanigans they got up to, including salmonella, mass poisonings, assassination attempts, bringing people experiencing homelessness, bringing them in from across the country to act as voters in Wasco County? Lead us through a little bit of that history of what happened when the sannyasins got pushed a little too far and the land seemed like it was going to be taken from them. What happened next?
Yeah, so a lot, as you're kind of encapsulating, there's a lot that happened. And as I was saying, there were a lot of successes for the disciples in their first couple of years. 1983 became a turning point where their fortunes changed, and the hammer of the law, political realities, outside opinion, hostile opinion starts really coming to bear on them. And it's clear they have to become a little more scrappy to survive. There's also a really important turning point in July of 1983 when Stephen Paul Pastor sets off a firebomb, actually 3 firebombs, in the Hotel Rajneesh in downtown Portland. This was a Rajneesh-owned property that was open to the public. Anyone could go and spend the night there if they wanted. And while he was in the middle of setting up the 3rd firebomb in one of those hotel rooms, Pastor accidentally ignited it, and he was the only one who was injured. Luckily, nobody else was injured, but it was a real threat to the community. And the thing that was most impactful to Sheila, who was the leader of the community at the time, she was the personal secretary to Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh. So she was really the person running the day-to-day administration of the entire commune. I should have made that clear earlier. But Sheila was really impacted by the fact that Stephen Paul Pastor had been at Rajneeshpuram, at the commune, just one day before the bombing happened at the hotel. He was there with two companions. They had duffel bags that they were carrying around. They were seen wandering the property late at night all over the ranch. They did meditation. They ate in the cafeteria. I mean, they were there in the heart of the commune, close to where Sheila lived, close to where Bhagwan lived. And then just, they basically got out of Rajneeshpuram. We don't know whether they ever planted any bombs there or if anything ever went off. I mean, we don't know of anything at Rajneeshpuram. And then that night, Pastor gets to the Hotel Rajneesh in Portland and sets off these bombs. So it was a real threat, the fact that this hostile person had been within their community just hours earlier. And so that really triggered a sense of, I won't say paranoia, because perhaps it was justified, but a sense of security from that moment on. And almost immediately, Sheila set up security measures to better protect them. Part of that was a spying network that kind of grew more elaborate over time. It involved tapping the phones at the commune. It involved a lot of bugging of rooms, of private rooms, so they could pick up conversations of people that were visiting from the outside who were suspicious. They bugged some of the accommodations for visitors so that, like, if a reporter from the Oregonian was staying overnight, they would record what they're saying. So there's really sort of this pervasive microphone kind of bugging operation going on. And then they also started to get guns. It was a lot of rifles being brought on there. That's when you start seeing all of the guard towers that go up along the county highway that leads from Antelope into the heart of the commune and beyond. You see all these security checkpoints. You see people on microphones. You see kind of it's sort of the vision of the rifle-toting Rajneeshi that we see often today, standing in front of Bhagwan's dais holding a rifle to protect him and to monitor the crowd. Things really changed in terms of a security perspective from the time of the bombing in July 1983 onwards. And then you mentioned some of the other things, which there's so much, it's hard to even go through all of it, but you mentioned the salmonella and the homeless people that were brought in, all of that kind of stuff. To understand all of that, you need to understand that there was a real fear in 1984 that the Wasco County government was going to demolish their city, essentially. As I mentioned, the fate of Rajneeshpuram, the city itself, the incorporation, was going back into the hands of the Wasco County Commission, which was three judges, and the Wasco County Court. And so the question was, when those judges take up the fate of Rajneeshpuram, what are they going to do? And if they say it's invalid, what happens then? Do we have to bulldoze everything we built? Do we have to tear it all down? Do we have to stop using it? Do we have to kick everybody off of our commune? Probably all of those things would have to happen if the city was declared invalid. So it was a real threat to them. And so at that time, it became a time of just furious and now insane planning to try to find a way to win the Wasco County election in their favor by having either Rajneeshi or pro-Rajneeshi candidates win the majority of those 3 seats in that election. And so that's where you see things like the Share a Home program, which is where thousands of homeless men and women from around the country were bussed in to live at the commune. And the only reason was so that they could vote. They had to be 18 years or older, they had to be American, they had to be able to vote. That was really all that was required. And they were promised room and board. They didn't have to convert to be a sannyasin. They just had to live there. Really, they had to be a body who could vote in this election to try to sway it in their favor. So one way they tried to influence that election was by bringing in more bodies. The other way they tried to influence it was by reducing anti-Rajneesh bodies that would show up to actually vote. And the plan that, there were multiple plans considered, but the leading idea that came out to do that was to poison people in the Dalles, to do a mass poisoning event, not to kill them, but to sicken them so that they couldn't show up to vote at the November 1984 election. And so suddenly in September, people started getting sick and showing up at the hospital in the Dalles and the surrounding area. By the end of it, it was more than 750 people were diagnosed with salmonella or had salmonella-like symptoms during that couple-week period in September of 84. And it was an experiment. They were testing out salmonella that they were manufacturing at a secret laboratory on the commune, which was just steps away from Sheila's home. Sheila, the leader of the commune, they had the secret laboratory they called the Chinese Laundry, and her nurse, who was the head of the medical center, was manufacturing, incubating salmonella, giving it to trusted lieutenants, trusted members of Sheila's inner circle, who would then go to the Dalles and would sprinkle it in things in the salad bars at various restaurants, in the potato salad, the pea salad, in the salad dressing itself. There's recorded reports of them sitting at tables where there's coffee creamer and opening the lid and dropping salmonella into the coffee creamer. And it was purely just to experiment with this salmonella to see if it would have a major impact and what sort of impact it would have. So it worked, I guess, except 750 people was not enough for them to win the election. It had to be bigger than that. And so by the time the election rolled around, all of their plans had failed. The share home program was a debacle for reasons I could go into, but they basically couldn't keep enough people there to be effective voters. And there was also challenges by the Secretary of State to their ability to vote. But then there was also the fact that the salmonella didn't have the wide impact that they hoped it would. So they couldn't reduce the voting population. They couldn't manipulate enough people to come into the community to be voters. So they sort of abandoned their efforts to win that political control. And if I could just make one point that's important for me to make, that's, I don't want to villainize the thousands of disciples who were at the commune. When I talk about some of these plots that are happening in 84 and 85, murder plots, poisoning plots, things like that, we're talking about a very small circle of disciples who were close to Sheila, who were part of her inner circle. They were the lead coordinators of the entire commune, but it's maybe at tops like 24 people. There were thousands of people that were living at the commune who just worked on the farm or worked in the pizza joint, and we're just there to kind of be with Bhagwan. They wanted to be in his energy. They wanted to go to his lectures. They wanted to dance, meditate, and do whatever it is they could do there, but they were not in on these plots. And so most disciples had no idea about the nefarious things that were happening that are now so famous and so well known. So it's just important for me to say that I don't want people to walk away from this thinking that the thousands of people there all knew about these really nefarious things happening. It was really a small subset of people that did.
Absolutely. Thank you for making that distinction. That's a great point. So in the end, can you tell us, why did Rajneeshpuram fail? Why did it fall apart? Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, so that's a complicated question, and it's something that I hope if people read the book or just become familiar with this history in any way, kind of reach their own conclusions about, because it's interesting to think about just as a sort of a philosophical question. Like, could a community like this have ever succeeded? Could it have succeeded in Oregon? Could it have succeeded in Wyoming if they really found a piece of land where there was no zoning regulations at all? Could it have succeeded there? I don't know. I'm not sure that it could have. So when you ask why did it fall apart or fail, it might have failed no matter what. And in fact, some disciples will tell you that it was always designed to fail, that Bhagwan had talked in the 1970s in India about the fact that he was building what's known as a mystery school, where a guru and his disciples, a master and his disciples, can kind of commune together and do experimental work on their energy and on themselves. And the idea was that mystery schools always fail because eventually they're found. They're supposed to be secret, but then people on the outside discover them and destroy them. And so there are some disciples who, when Rajneeshpuram fell apart, said, well, that was always the master's plan. This was always what was going to happen. This was never supposed to be a permanent city that would be existing in the year 2022. It always had a short-term lease on life and it was always going to be gone. But when we actually look at the facts of what happened, there were, as you suggested, some murder plotting that was happening in 1985 that again came out of desperation among Sheila and her inner circle of people to try to figure out a way to salvage their community, to protect Bhagwan, who was facing deportation from immigration proceedings, to protect the city itself, which was under multiple challenges, legal challenges and otherwise. And so there were some murder plots that kind of came out of that desperation of public officials and also people within the community. And to make a long story short, in July of 1985, there was a real effort made to try to kill one of the leading disciples, a physician to Bhagwan himself, his personal doctor, who Sheila saw as an enemy of the commune and of Bhagwan himself. And so she sort of whipped up her disciples, her little loyal coterie, into thinking that he deserved to die, otherwise he might harm Bhagwan himself. And so there was a real attempt to kill him. A disciple has admitted to it now that she went up and injected him with something that was intended to kill him. He almost died. He was airlifted to the hospital. I actually think he ended up in Bend at the hospital there to get treatment, and he survived. But when that murder attempt failed, the wind sort of went out of the plotting sails, and some of the top lieutenants said, "We've had enough. We can't do this anymore. We can't try to kill the people that we're supposed to be protecting within our community. I know it's gotten bad, but it can't be that bad that we have to do that." And once that happened, it was the beginning of the end. Sheila was losing her power within her own inner circle. She was losing influence with Bhagwan, who was not impressed by what she'd been able to do, which in the year preceding that was not very much. She'd been traveling a lot. There's talk that she had been maybe taking a lot of sleeping pills and tranquilizers and things like that. And she just kind of wanted to get out. She was done being his secretary. And once Sheila was out the door, the whole thing sort of fell apart. And then, of course, once Sheila left in September of '85, Bhagwan then revealed to the world evidence of Sheila's crimes, which he then entirely put on her. She's the one who planned the murder plots, and she's the one who did the salmonella, and divorced himself entirely from any knowledge of any of that stuff, and said this was all Sheila, investigate her. And so that was criminally, that was the beginning of the end. That's when the FBI and everybody showed up at the commune, started the investigation, and everything just fell apart.
Wow, that's fascinating that you say that again, there's perhaps that retroactive approach of saying, oh, well, this is a mystery school. It was always intended to fail. Yeah. So kind of that retroactive truth telling. That's very fascinating. And you kind of mentioned this, the author's note preceding the book. You give a kind of a bold statement. You say, at its heart, this book is about the attraction to power in all its beguiling forms, and how every utopia finds its victims. Can you tell me about the use of the word victims there? Why did you choose that specific language?
Yeah, so part of it has to do with the idea of utopia in general, which is that there is no such thing as an objective utopia. A utopia is totally in the mind of whoever's looking at it. And given the vast complexity of humanity, one person's utopia is definitely somebody else's dystopia. It's, you know, the opposite of the way that they would want to structure their lives, or the opposite of the society that they would want to live in. So a utopia is always going to be a subjective thing no matter what, and it's always going to harm people. It's impossible to create a society that doesn't in some way disadvantage or harm somebody else. And so when I was really researching this story, I talked to dozens of people that lived at the commune, who were part of Bhagwan's communities, to try to understand their perspectives. And even people that today are still loyal disciples, because there still are devotees of Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh, or Osho as he was later known. There's still devotees today of him. Everybody experienced some trauma coming out of that community, that utopia. You know, there was disillusionment. There were people that really questioned their attachment to Sheila, the fact that Sheila was allowed to have so much power and get away with so many things, and disillusionment with the idea of master guru altogether, or the idea of surrender. And, you know, I talked to so many different people that had different responses to their time being associated with Rajneeshpuram, but everybody sort of had a trauma that they were still dealing with, from what I understood when I talked to them. And so that's kind of where the idea of victims came from, was that even if there had been no crimes, even if there had been no conflicts with people on the outside, even if Bhagwan had just gone and made this community exactly as he wanted, there would still be victims. For example, the children, like I was mentioning, who were brought there not because they wanted to be there, but because their parents made them go there. Many of them became the victims of sexual abuse because there were not really any expectations in terms of whether adults and kids could have sex or not. There was no real mores around that, and it was allowed to happen. People knew about it, and it just was allowed to happen. So even in the ideal vision of Bhagwan, there would be something like that. There'd still be victims, and so that's where that term came from, and that's kind of the idea that I was grappling with throughout the whole book.
Absolutely. What brought you to this study? What was it? How did you find the story, and what have you learned from it? And this question comes from the audience. Is this taking you somewhere else in your discoveries?
That's a great question. So I was born in the 1980s, and I'm from Minnesota. And so I grew up with this history not being part of my consciousness. I think by the time I was growing up, this story had sort of faded from national consciousness, the Rajneeshpuram story. And I didn't learn about it until Wild Wild Country came out on Netflix. And I think I, like so many other people, watched it and was like, what? Like, this happened? What? Like, and just every event that happened was wilder than the next. And so I finished that. I watched that docuseries twice all the way through and had a gazillion questions about almost everything that I saw. And I thought, okay, well, I'm going to go get the book on Rajneeshpuram and I'm going to read it and find out all the answers to my questions. And there is, or at least there was, there was no book on Rajneeshpuram really at the time. Now there's a lot that's been done, and I don't want to undermine any of the great work that's been done by reporters for the Oregonian and other magazines, newspapers. I mean, people have been looking at this history for a long time, but I was looking for like a comprehensive history of Rajneeshpuram in a book that would help me understand everything, and that didn't exist. And so I think I just kind of went on my own journey. I mean, it kind of just took me along the way. I didn't intend to become somebody who knows a lot about this topic, but I just started reading every memoir I could get my hands on, every article, kind of piecing together as much information as I could until I reached the point where I thought I should compile this in some way and share it. And so that's where the podcast idea came from. And then over time, I realized that I just needed to gather more original material. I wanted to do interviews. I wanted to talk to disciples. I wanted to do archival research and go to Oregon and go to all the great archives there. And so writing a book gave me an excuse to do that. So I was able to dig in and then write the history of it. So that's kind of how I got to the topic. To the question about, do you still have it? How was it phrased?
Yes, they asked, what brought you to study and research this topic, and is it taking you somewhere else in your discoveries?
God, I still love that question. It's such a good one. Yeah, I think so. I think researching this has changed me, I think. And so it's always going to affect anything that I do. in terms of projects, I'm not working on anything else in this area right now. But what's cool is that it's made me part of a community of people who are interested in this topic, people who lived through it. And almost every day I'm getting messages or emails from people that just want to talk about it, who lived through it, who are interested in it, who are going to work on a documentary about it, who are exploring the aspects of abuse in the community, who are going to do a podcast about it. And so I'm just kind of part of a community now of researchers, which has been really awesome, really rewarding. And I love talking to people about it. So I'm not working on anything formal, but this has definitely transformed me and kind of put me into this new world, which has been great.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful way to look at it. So another question from our audience, were you able to interview Sheila during this process? And if so, what was she like?
Yeah, so I did interview Sheila 3 times. She was super generous with her time, which was great. So Sheila's still alive and kicking. She lives in Switzerland and she runs 2 nursing homes there, which people familiar with her often find surprising, and maybe not that surprising, but that's what she's doing. She was very generous with me and with her time. And, yeah, so it was interesting talking to her. She's a character. She's so charismatic. I just, it was fun just kind of experiencing that firsthand because she is such a force of energy. It's hard though, because she has a story that's very fixed in her head. And it's that she didn't do anything criminally wrong. She'll never confess to any of the crimes, the murder plots, none of that stuff she'll never confess to any of that stuff. And there's certain objective evidence out there or testimonies of many, many, many people who knew her that she just completely denies as being true. So it's sort of hard talking to her because there's some things that I think anybody would call an objective fact that she just denies. And so sometimes you just have to kind of accept that that's her answer and move on and just kind of weigh that with all of the bulk of the other evidence. But she's a really fascinating person. And I really loved, especially when she talked about things that didn't really make her look bad. I mean, she doesn't want to admit to any crimes, obviously, and things like that. But sometimes I'd ask her about things about just her relationship with Bhagwan and some things that were just kind of Bhagwan's relationship with gay people, which was really interesting and something that hasn't been talked about much. But he was very anti-gay. And Sheila had a big gay group that was around her all the time at Rajneeshpuram, very supportive of gays. Of gay people. And so, yeah, it was interesting talking just about that dynamic. Like, how did you end up working with this guru and how did that work? And yeah, so it was kind of fun talking to her about kind of off the wall topics. But yeah, I talked to her 3 times, and I'm glad that I did.
All right, we have just a couple more minutes left, so I'm going to invite anyone in the audience to please put those last questions in the Q&A. My last question for you, Mr. King. In the acknowledgements, you say you knew that there was a story about the Sannyasins and their extraordinary commune in Oregon that had not yet been told. And the more I chewed on it, the more that you were convinced that you should at least try to tell the story. So what do you think that you specifically have brought to this story that no one else has?
Yeah, so I came at this is maybe controversial, but I came at this history trying to have a sense of empathy for the sannyasins in the middle of it. And when I say empathy, I don't mean sympathy. I don't mean like I agree with what they did or think that anything in particular was good or bad. I just wanted to understand. It came from a sense of understanding. And so I think that that's what I tried to bring to my work, was a sense of non-judgment and a sense of understanding and learning the cause and effect and learning the trajectory. You know, they don't just poison 750 people out of nowhere. That doesn't just like happen. There's things that lead up to that idea. Now, it's a horrible idea. It's an awful thing to do, but I wanted to understand what got them to that point. And to do that, you need to have some empathy and try to come at it from their perspective and just see what the dynamics were, the power dynamics, the control, et cetera, within the community itself and within the master-disciple relationship. So I'd like to think that that's something that I brought to the table here, was just coming at it from a sense of really eagerness to understand and be non-judgmental to the extent that I could. Of course, when it comes to murders and things like that, you're allowed to be a little judgmental.
No, I love that answer. I think that that is a really interesting take on research, particularly given your background as a lawyer. One knows that the main point of journalism and research is to provide an objective view of the subject you're studying, which we all know as humans is entirely impossible, just as it is impossible to have a utopian society. So I think that that is a really empathy as the angle in which you conducted the research is a very interesting one, and one that I think really speaks in your book, definitely. So if anyone who hasn't read it yet, the link to Russell King's book is in the chat. I'll put it in there again in case anyone joined to the program late. We have just a couple more questions from our audience members.
Sure.
Who was your most interesting firsthand interview for the book, and what did they have to say?
Oh my gosh. There's so many. So anyone who was involved in this community has a fascinating life story just inherently, because anyone who lived in this community saw just wild things and had a very non-traditional life. I mean, so by definition, anytime you talk to anybody in this community, I think you're talking to somebody interesting. So I'm loath to call out anyone in particular from the community, because everyone was so interesting and so helpful and good in that respect. One kind of fun interview that I did that just kind of was a quirk was a guy who actually lived in the castle in New Jersey with Bhagwan while he was temporarily there. It was just a random lead that I followed, where I kind of saw this footnote in some immigration thing from 1985 that said there was this guy who was a non-Rajneeshi who was already living in this castle, and he ended up being basically Bhagwan's roommate, not living in the same room, but kind of housemate for a while. And I thought, God, what must have that been like? And anyways, the guy's still alive. He's a city planner in the Montclair area, and I interviewed him, and it ended up forming the preface to my book. If you read kind of the intro section, it's really his story that I'm telling there as an outsider. So that was kind of a fun one. But everyone I talked to was great.
Yes, I remember that the man who was in the castle already, that they were trying to like hustle out, and that sounds like a fascinating recount.
Yeah.
So a very good last question to kind of wrap this all up. How did the death of Rajneesh affect the community, if at all? Because all gurus they are mortal in the end. So how did that affect the community?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's, not for me to write, but there's probably another book to write there about Bhagwan's community after Rajneeshpuram. And it's something that anytime you ask even a former disciple about, there's this whole political world in the Osho community that persists to this day. Bhagwan died in 1990 in India. He was back at his original ashram property there. He died under what some say is mysterious circumstances, but I mean, he was very old and well, he wasn't that old, but he was in very poor health and had been for a long time. And his community persisted. There's still people that kind of stepped in and took lead of the community. And it's interesting because it kind of followed the trajectory that Bhagwan always said would happen with religious leaders. There was this mystical aura around religious leaders like Jesus Christ and Buddha and Bhagwan. And then once they died, humans would come in and just kind of create a bureaucracy that they used to control people. Some would say that's what happened after Bhagwan died. But that's a whole other book that I have not researched, but would be interesting to look at.
Yes, absolutely. To be continued, the sequel. We would eagerly await the sequel. Russell, I just want to say thank you so much on behalf of our audience tonight and on behalf of Deschutes Public Library. Thank you for taking the time today to talk to us about Rajneeshpuram, this failed utopia of Bhagwan. It's a really interesting part of the Pacific Northwest history and of Central Oregon's history in particular. And we're really grateful that you joined us tonight from all across on the other side of the country to give us this first-hand experience about what it was like behind the podcast, behind the book, and inside this interesting part of our world. If you have not had the chance, I highly recommend checking out this book by Russell King. You can find it. There's a link in the chat to our BiblioCommons. And of course, check out his podcast, Building Utopia. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And thank you again to Russell King. We hope to see you again soon at all of our libraries. All of our libraries are open and also in the virtual web. So check out DeschutesLibrary.org for everything else that is fun, free, and coming to you through your Deschutes Public Library. Have a good night, everyone, and we hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.